Hey everyone, we're just going to give it a minute just while people join. We've got quite a lot of people attending this webinar today. But yeah, we're looking forward to presenting to you today. Great, we'll give it just a little bit longer and then we will start.
Sure. Matty, you're looking very relaxed there.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh God, sorry, I'm not. That's not what I was going for.
It's hard to believe it's November since I saw you last.
Oh yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I think we've got most of the attendees online now. So we'll start. Hello there, and welcome to the launch of the Themis Financial Crime Russian Risk Report. Today we are going to discuss the findings from our report into the financial crime risk presented by the Russian Federation. This has obviously been a very long-running issue. Russia was suspended by the Financial Action Task Force in February. And I think what's interesting about that is obviously there's a political element to the sanctions regime being placed on Russia. Opponents of Russia have sanctioned the country, whereas supporters of the country haven't. So there's a political element. But I think what we found doing our Russian risk report was actually that there's serious financial crime risks across the spectrum, irrespective of the invasion of Ukraine from last year. And I think this is what we want to discuss today, is just understanding these financial crime risks from Russia. And today I'm very lucky to be joined by a really expert panel. So you'll see today we have Valeriya Melnichuk. Now, Valeriya is Vice President at Highgate, a strategy consultancy based in London. Valeriya is also an advisor to the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine and a coordinator of the Ukrainian working group on FATF. She has expertise in sovereign debt restructuring and was formerly a BBC journalist based in Kiev. We also have Matej Roska, editor of the investigative news site reporter.london. Previously, Matej worked at Politico and S&P Global Markets Intelligence, covering topics including Russian-related money laundering, complex fraud, and economic aspects of organised crime. Finally, we have Stephen Ray, the chair and publisher of AML Intelligence, a global anti-financial crime and compliance publication that has provided excellent coverage of risk areas related to Russia since the invasion. So thank you all for joining us today. So I think before we get into the Q&A, I can see we have a lot of people on the webinar today, and a lot of people from various different degrees of financial crime expertise. So normally what we do is a poll, but I think today we're going to do a Slido. And so what we do with Slido is if you click on this QR code here, you can actually answer your own questions about what Russia-related compliance challenges have you faced over the last year. So if you accept this QR code, then you will be able to type in yourselves what actual challenges you've been facing. And I think this is just a really interesting aspect for the audience to really understand actually across the breadth, because we have people joining us worldwide today with a varying different sanctions regimes they have to abide by, and equally their own opinions on dealing with Russia. So we can see immediately sanctions screening is coming up. Incidentally, when these words get bigger and bigger, that's a sign that more people are using them, which again sort of shows you the element of risk. While I was researching this webinar, I came across a really interesting quote from the Russian oligarch turned political dissident Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And when he was busy making his money in Russia, he had an interesting quote, which was, "A bank is like a waiter. Its business is to cater to clients independently of their political beliefs." And I think we can say that that view has very much changed now. Politics plays a huge role in financial crime risk. But equally, what we also know from it is that financial crime is divorced from politics as well, and it is just its own risk. And I think today, for instance, we've seen the videos from Yevgeny Prigozhin's flat, where there is money in boxes, there's gold bars lying around. And it just shows you the level of issues that we are facing in terms of Russia being a part of the global financial system. So great. Well, thanks very much for all those who are joining in. I think we can see sanctions evasion, dual use goods. These are the really big issues that we're dealing with. And again, I think you can see some of the political guidance in terms of the EU Article 5 restrictions, energy, beneficial ownership. This is certainly something we're seeing as well in terms of the hidden UBOs and particularly Russian businesses moving to more secrecy jurisdictions. So I think we'll leave it there, but I think we can see clearly here as a panel what are the key issues we'll be looking to discuss today. So thanks very much for taking the time to share your thoughts. So to begin, I'm going to start with you, Valeriya. In FATF's statement in February 2023, suspending Russia, they noted that jurisdictions must remain wary of threats to the integrity, safety, and security of the international financial system arising from Russia's actions in Ukraine. So would you be able to describe for us the risks that FATF is warning states of and possible solutions to mitigate these risks?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Well, to start with, Russia has always been a high-risk jurisdiction for financial crime. But since the invasion of Ukraine, these risks have grown, have increased. FATF has been strengthening its response. It started with condemning the invasion and then all the way to suspending Russia's membership in February 2023. And so when the membership was suspended, FATF said that all jurisdictions have to be wary about attempts that Russia is making to evade sanctions. It warned about malicious cyber activities emanating from Russia. And said that it was concerned about reported arms trade with UN sanctioned jurisdictions. To translate this into an understandable language, so Russia trades weapons with Iran and North Korea, and it's a concern because it's a risk to global security, then uses crypto and cyber for malicious and illicit activities and exporting these activities, so outside of Russia. And this is essentially a subtle call for enhanced due diligence by all actors, but FATF can't say that if the country isn't on the grey list, on the blacklist. But this guidance is what it essentially means. But importantly, since the membership suspension, Russia has not stopped its malign behavior that it got suspended for and continues to violate FATF standards and create serious risk for global financial security. And it's important to differentiate and that it's not about morality. It's not about reputation. It's not about what Russia is doing in Ukraine, although it's horrible and it's unspeakable and should stop. But it's also about, independently of what's going on in Ukraine, Russia presents a risk to global financial security, but also to international businesses dealing with or in Russia. And just to give a few examples, Russia finances proliferation. It places nuclear weapons in neighboring Belarus. It's the first time since the breakup of the Soviet Union that the weapons are transferred outside of Russia's territory. Trades weapons with blacklisted Iran, finances terrorism through Wagner and other proxies, cooperates with North Korea, including on the nuclear program. Some of the Russian individuals have been sanctioned by the US for that, launches massive cyber attacks on Ukraine and other states, uses crypto to launder money, to finance illicit activities, including its army and Wagner. And these are attacks on security, but these are serious risks for international businesses. They may be willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly participating in these activities or facilitating them. So there's lots we can go into other predicate crimes that happened after Russia's suspension, including Kakhovka Dam, including nuclear terrorism threat with the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe that Russia is complicating maintenance of and potentially threatening to blow up. Then the proliferation risk I mentioned, and the continued trade with Iran and weapon trade, increased cyber risk, intensifying efforts to circumvent sanctions. There's also state-sponsored human trafficking, and that we go back to ICC indictment of Putin and his officials. I'm trying to find the right diplomatic word to say that, for forceful deportation of Ukrainian children. And there are numerous statements that say that there are risks of human trafficking, and increased levels of corruption and state capture. I mean, the Russian state has been corrupt all along, but it's becoming more and more. There is a nexus between the Russian leadership and the organized crime, and you can see that from what Prigozhin cooperation with the state turned into, and so forth. So what can be done about it? In terms of public policy, better sanctions enforcement and comprehensive national business advisories to guide businesses on serious financial crime risks that they're exposed to if they do business in or with Russia. So again, not about morality, not about reputation, it's about serious financial crime you're exposing yourself to. Then at the same time, corporations can take action without waiting for public policy to catch up. And first, they must recognize the financial crime and other risks associated with Russia, like there is a mobilization risk that your assets can be mobilized for war effort, because there is a law that allows that nobody needs any consent for that, really, if the commissioners decide that they want to do that. Then and that the businesses can be partaking in and must go beyond sanctions to enhance their due diligence, examine their supply chains, and ensure that they're not unknowingly implicating themselves in Russia's crimes and human rights abuses.
Fantastic. Thanks, Valeriya. I think, certainly that's something we felt on the research and report is this sort of desire to exit Russia, but then also people are also mentioning, we had Diageo obviously reported this month talking about the sort of difficulties in unwinding their positions. And I think what you speak very clearly is that by not unwinding these positions, you're still aiding this reprehensible war effort. I can see we've been joined by Olga. Welcome to the webinar, Olga.
Thank you.
And I'll just give you a quick introduction for our audience today. So Olga Lautman is from the Institute for European Integrity and a senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Olga's research focuses on organised crime and intelligence operations in both Russia and Ukraine, in particular active campaigns conducted by the Kremlin to destabilise democratic practices and influence foreign elections. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Olga.
Thank you.
And I thought, actually, given you're here, we might jump in straight for a question for you, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
So I think, given that your work focuses on hybrid warfare used by Russia to destabilize the international system, this threat goes beyond simply money laundering or sanctions concerns, which we highlight throughout the report. Would you be able to describe for our audience there a few of the threats to national security posed by Russian actors?
Yes, absolutely. So, Russia, and this goes back a long time, back to the Soviet Union, more so after the collapse of the Soviet Union and it became an open state. Russia has a whole system of conducting hybrid warfare. So basically, they cannot fight on the battlefield against the West. So they used various methods, mainly through enablers in the West. And you see this through the NGOs they set up. You see this through the Orthodox Church. You see this through the oligarchs who are frontmen for the Kremlin, moving the money for the Kremlin, and also using this money to finance some intelligence operations. So this is a huge systemic problem that we've had for the past few decades, and you see it in every single facet of our society. So there is absolutely no wonder that the far right has been supported by Russia over the past, decade in the United States, across Europe, and it's done through an oligarch or a businessman, and the church and Wagner mercenaries. And it's also no wonder that you saw several, high-profile oligarchs pop up in interference in Brexit and interference in the United States election. So Russia's, operations go way beyond money laundering, and they use everything from organized crime to capture politicians, to capture, politicians and prosecutors and Western figures, to oligarchs, to pretty much everything. And this is something that we have to be extremely cautious about, because this has been avoided and people don't understand how, the depth of this problem and how to address it. And, this is something that Ukraine was a testing ground for Russia over the past few decades. And Russia conducted pretty much every operation that we see unleashed against the West was tested in Ukraine. And we need to be very vigilant, and we need to start looking at it differently, because you see, like I said, I focus on the NGO sector with the Institute for European Integrity. There were 2 NGOs set up, one in France, for instance, one in Germany. And these NGOs were outfits for recruitment of local politicians, former defense ministers, and pretty much all high-figure, influential people in the West. And then they use these people to implode the countries and cause the division campaigns and run the disinformation campaigns. One NGO in particular was set up, and these politicians were taken to Moscow. They were taken to Crimea to in 2015, 16, 17 to, basically say that Crimea is Russian territory, which it's not. And then they use their position inside of government to try to lift sanctions on Russia. So it is a very big problem with this, and this is something we must address. We have started sanctioning, figures, but even now you see Russia is using, a web of companies to bypass sanctions and figures. And people, say, oh, Vladimir Putin is a master strategist. He's not. What he figured out is that the trillions that had poured out of the country over the past several decades, 2 decades, were able to buy the enablers. And you have in, for instance, London or Londongrad, you have an army of lawyers and accountants and lobbyists and journalists and pretty much everyone doing their bidding. And we see it around us pretty much on a daily basis, even with media outlets, for instance, who don't mean to launder Kremlin propaganda. They inadvertently do so because of how prevalent this propaganda is and the disinformation is. And even like yesterday, to give an example, Bloomberg ran an article from Friedman, who is an oligarch, who is a front man for Putin, who was involved in, several intelligence operations, including U.S. elections, that he is hurting from sanctions and that his sanctions has destroyed his life. Why is this a news story? Or for instance, with Kakhovka Dam, we saw how, since last fall, Ukraine has been warning about Kakhovka Dam being mined and that, Russia will blow it up. And then when it actually did happen and the explosion occurred, every single Western outlet was repeating Russia's defense minister Shoigu's statement, making it equivalent to,
I think we'll. Yeah, I think we're definitely we're covering quite a lot of this, and actually I think it's really interesting, Olga, because you speak to actually what people were saying before you came on the webinar, which is I think the huge issue people are facing. I think certainly from a financial crime perspective is the sanctions and also is the beneficial ownership information, and as we talk about this web of companies and the impossibility of accessing that information. So I think it really I think what you're speaking to and actually the active measures you're talking about, I think the link for the financial system is very clear. I'd just like to bring in Mate here. So Mate, given your expertise as a journalist, and obviously we've been talking in terms of journalism, I mean, despite Russia's flagrant violations of the standards set by FATF, Russia wasn't blacklisted 3 weeks ago in the FATF meeting. So at the most recent FATF plenary at the end of June, Russia wasn't blacklisted. Why not? And what are the implications of this decision, do you think?
Well, thanks. It's hard to decide exactly why FATF didn't do it, but certainly there are countries within FATF that sympathize with Russia. There's a whole sort of the non-Western countries that are still in business with Russia, countries like Brazil, South Africa. These are big, important economies. in Europe, even, you know, Hungary, even Austria, I would argue, is a pro-Russian or you know, roughly Russia-friendly, more or less Russia-friendly country. And across Asia as well, there's lots of countries across Africa. So these countries did not vote to include Russia on the blacklist or even on the grey list, but it still shows that FATF has questions to answer. These technical standards that FATF is examining are really totally overshadowed by current events. Russia is not a failed state. Russia has a functioning bureaucracy. I only half jokingly tell my friends that we should kidnap Elvira Nabiullina and Mikhail Mishustin and get them to run our own institutions, because these people are very capable bureaucrats. They know how to collect tax. They know how to make things run in an extremely corrupt and extremely high pressure environment. So mind you, to keep the Russian state and the Russian financial system from imploding in this environment takes talent. And for someone like Nabiullina to put her talents to work in the service of an evil dictatorship murdering people on several continents, including, you know, an attempted genocide on Ukraine, which is well documented, doesn't take away from any of her talents. So you're not dealing with moral issues here. And I only wonder what, already things are very awkward for FATF, but I wonder what would have happened if the vote had happened a few days after it did, when already the Prigozhin coup or Prigozhin mutiny or whatever it is was underway, and this mutiny ended up with Putin basically taking ownership of Prigozhin and Wagner, and Putin admitting on the record that the Kremlin poured billions into Wagner, which is an absolutely horrendous, murderous, torturing organization. It revels in torture, it revels in terrorism, it decapitates people and puts it on social media. So this is the Russian ISIS, you know, and Putin took ownership of it. And I wonder how happy FATF would have been to basically validate a government that takes ownership of something like Wagner. In the same vein, the government of Russia is capable of fighting financial crime, and there was a case in Moldova called the laundromat, where many billions were taken out of Russia and laundered through a couple of Moldovan banks. And lo and behold, the Russians didn't like that, and they put everyone who orchestrated this case on the Russian side. They put them in prison. 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we had a sentencing, a really robust sentencing of one of the bankers involved. Over 10 years in prison he got. So it shows, but in the bureaucratic paradigm that FATF operates in, Russia can be regarded as a viable country, as a viable system of fighting financial crime. When they want it, they can do it. So it's not a failed state. So FATF has made a political choice of its own to look at things through this extreme bureaucratic lens and just check the paper standards and so forth, rather than look at what the effects are of allowing a financial crime superpower like Russia to sit alongside all of the other economies.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mate. I think it's really interesting what you're talking about in terms of Russia having actually robust internal systems, and certainly that's what we're hearing in the course of this report. A lot of respect for Elvira Nabiullina, for instance. I also think it's very interesting. The Russian Investigative Committee, is run by Alexander Bastrukin, who has got a lot of issues in terms of some of his deputies being associated links with Vori Visakoni, for instance. And so if you think the main person essentially dealing with FATF in Russia has issues to answer, shows, I think, the sort of depth of sort of capture of Russia's institutions by Putin's cronies. So Stephen, it'd be great to bring you in here, and I know we've discussed before some of your thoughts around this. I think if we could move to the sanctions aspect, the proliferation of sanctions has severely limited Russia's access to Western markets. How, therefore, is Russia still managing to finance its war in Ukraine, and where are they sourcing these weapons from?
Of course, well, as everybody knows, like Russia has got a huge war chest. Like it's got tens of billions in its treasuries that it can fund the war from. And of course, trade with non-Western and non-European countries has increased. So, you know, trade with China, Iran, Brazil, and other countries has increased through the war. So they're getting funds from that type of trade as well as their grain exports. So, okay, Russia is suffering, but it's not as suffering as much as you know, Western sanctions experts would have hoped for. So the Russian economy, as Mate has indicated, hasn't failed. Russian economy is still trading and still making revenues, which is funding the war machine. Similarly, then, you know, Olga referenced the old Soviet system and, for example, relations with South Africa. I remember being in a bar in Durban and meeting the deputy head of the ANC military wing, who spoke about spending decades on the run in Havana and Moscow. So, you know, you have that South African link with the old Soviet system. And so those ANC guys are now in power in South Africa. So those links are still there. So you saw a Russian warship leave Cape Town last year full of weapons destined for Russia. So the United States revealed this shipment earlier this year, and it actually affected the valuation of the rand. So maybe that was a sobering thought for the South African authorities. And I'm sure they've weaned off weapon supplies to Russia as a result. Nonetheless, Iran clearly has been trading a lot of weapons with Russia and the Kremlin, and you see Iranian drones used to deadly effect on the war on the front in Ukraine. So you got those kamikaze drones that the Iranians have supplied, and then you've got more sophisticated drones that have also been supplied from Iran to deadly effect. And that will continue because, you know, that axis of evil between the Kremlin and Tehran is there for the long haul. Similarly, you know, you have North Korea supplying artillery shells and other artillery supplies to Russia. Then I met John Sweeney, formerly one of Valeriya's colleagues in BBC. John was one of those BBC Panorama reporters who went to great lengths to expose Putin's crimes and his mafia-style state when Europe and others were cozying up to Putin. But John Sweeney has always been there for the long haul in exposing Putin's crimes. But he spoke about the Dubai corridor, the United Arab Emirates corridor, where weapons parts come into Dubai, are put together in Dubai, and then shipped off to Russia. And then, of course, you've also got the suspicions about China. Is China, you know, surreptitiously supplying weapons and weapons parts to Russia, albeit it denies doing so? And you also have the arms dealers, and Russia has been quite proficient in producing arms dealers down the years. And you saw Victor Bout, the notorious arms dealer, released in a prisoner swap from the United States and back to Russia. So I'm sure the Kremlin is making good use of his so-called talents in procuring weapons for its war on and its aggression in Ukraine. Likewise, you got the Wagner Group, who are in all parts of Africa, and they're sourcing weapons and money in Africa as well and shipping it back to the Kremlin. And you will see that Putin, albeit he's disbanded the Wagner Group to a great extent, is still using their network in Africa to supply him with cash and weapons out of Africa. So those are some of the ways Russia is supplying its war machine. It'll continue to do so without any great effect. Like, where are the sanctions prosecutions in Europe? You know, has Europe brought any sanctions prosecutions? It has not. And similarly then with Mate's reference to FATF, India was threatened by FATF, or threatened by the Kremlin, that if it voted to blacklist or greylist Russia, Russia would stop supplying it with cheap food and cheap arms. So clearly Delhi was aware of that, and I'm sure it threatened other countries as well, but albeit India did leak the threats that had been made by the Kremlin to it. So, Russia has been proficient in asymmetric warfare for a long time. It's part of what it's done. It did it largely successfully in Crimea while the West slept. And so it's now been using it ever since. At the same time, you saw the report today from Bloomberg where Ukrainian tanks now number more than Russian tanks. So that's a good thing. It means, sanctions are having some extent. Russia has spent 10 million artillery shells since the start of the war, but it can only produce 1 million artillery shells a year through its economy. So, sanctions are having an effect, but sanctions loopholes are allowing Russia continue this war indefinitely.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. And I think that's a really good in-depth overview. I'm conscious we're halfway through and we are beginning to get some questions through, and we have one which is quite pointed, and I think it's probably worth addressing just in case. So Michael Nagel says that he's interested in understanding actually how we can a hands-on approach to tackling some of these problems. That's certainly something we look to discuss. But he also, mentions that the panel is potentially being quite tough towards Russia. Austria was mentioned, for instance. I would just contend, I do think the facts speak for themselves at the moment. And, certainly with regards to Austria, there are, prominent oligarchs such as Dmitry Firtash taking refuge in these countries. So it's not backed up without evidence. And I would contend as well that what we're seeing day in, day out in Ukraine is we're seeing sanctions busting, we're seeing targeting of civilians. We're seeing the whole network of financial crime risk. So irrespective, I think, of your feelings towards Russia, Russia's a place I've worked in for over 10, 15 years. I have a lot of respect for a lot of people from Russia, and this isn't meant to be a biased forum, but equally the facts do speak for themselves, and they do need to be addressed. But please do feel free to contribute with comments and questions, because we will seek to address as many of these in the last quarter of this webinar. Okay, so with that, I think going on to you, Valeriya, and just some of the latest news. Putin admitted in the last week that the Wagner Group was fully funded by the Russian state, having received more than $2 billion US. Given this admission, coupled with the designation of Wagner as a terrorist organization, what does this mean for businesses continuing to operate in Russia?
It's a very good question, and I'd like us to just stop for a second and let it sink in. Wagner is fully financed from the state budget. For years, the Russian leadership denied having anything to do with Wagner, and yet again, they lied, as they always do. I think no one is surprised now, but that's good to kind of admit it and acknowledge. Now, what does that mean? The Wagner Group uses Russian state funds to spread death and destruction across the world, in Ukraine, in Africa, in particular in the war crimes that have been registered in Mali, Central African Republic, Libya, Sudan. They have been supporting Assad regime in Syria, and the things they're doing there are horrendous. So it's not about Ukraine again. And being a Ukrainian, I can actually say that in more and more, and I can't say enough of it. It's not only about Ukraine. It's about threats to the whole world. So given that the Wagner Group is being funded directly from the Russian budget, any entity dealing with the Russian jurisdiction is at risk of contributing to terrorism and organized crime financing, depending on how the organization is designated. Some countries designated it as terrorist, UN hasn't, but US, for example, designated it as a transnational organized criminal organization. It's still not good. No one denies that financing Wagner is not great. So what does that also mean for international businesses which continue doing business and paying taxes in Russia? They're contributing to the state budget and indirectly financing Wagner now. So what does it mean for businesses outside of Russia dealing with money originating in Russia? It's that they face a high risk of participating in Wagner-related illicit activities, such as laundering of illicit funds, because that's what Wagner do through lots of different intermediaries in the West, such as supporting their criminal activities in various countries and assisting with supply and financing of the criminal group through different proxies. And interestingly, mercenary groups are illegal in Russia, according to the country's own criminal code. So the fact that Wagner mercenary group was funded from the state budget in violation of Russian laws and norms, once again demonstrates that the existing legislation is no more than a smokescreen covering up the ineffective system for prevention of terrorism and criminal organizations financing, and that the system is good on paper, but it's abused by the regime at will. So you can't predict, you can't really rely on that. I would anticipate that more and more trouble will be coming to those who are maintaining business relationship with Russia. In compliance, risk assessment, due diligence, all these costs will be increasing and the risks will be increasing as the Russian economy moves more and more on the war footing. And that I would agree with Stephen saying that sanctions do have an effect, and they have an effect in a way that Russian Ministry of Finance has to redistribute the budget, because now they don't have enough to finance everything they always like to finance. Now they have to redistribute and take away from social spending and other spending and redistribute to the war budget. So those companies that continue saying, oh, we're producing cookies, so we have nothing to do with anything of this, but they are some of the largest taxpayers in the country. You can't use that excuse anymore. And what they can do about it? Well, businesses must pull out of Russia. I mean, it's a no-brainer, but some are still kind of trying to cling on to some excuses. Those not in Russia must enhance their due diligence. Often Russian intermediary networks are complex, but very often they're actually quite primitive and can be easily spotted with proper red flag system in place. I mean, we have a case from our research where it took probably an hour of Google searching to find out that a company, a front shop registered in the US with a Russian citizen being an only person in that company. It was set up after February 2022, and it was supplying parts to St. Petersburg Institute of some, I forget the name, technology or physics or something, that is producing Orlan drones. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to find it. Like, this is all public information. It's just the supply, it's just the due diligence and enhanced due diligence. And then there are red flags for some of the systems, some of the companies and some of the things you have to look out for, specifically related to the post invasion risks. And third, yeah.
Okay, we're running a bit short on time, so I think probably one final point before we move on.
So it's the final point on what can be done is the government's business advisories to help businesses understand these serious risks, and that they can't just close eyes and hope all of it will disappear.
Absolutely, and thank you. I think, again, the audiences are practical solutions. I think you've offered some really helpful ones there. We've got just over 10 minutes left, I think, before we want to start getting some questions from the audience. So Olga, I just want to move on to you quickly, because, as Valeriya mentioned, some things have changed, and it'd be really interesting to understand from your point of view, how has the financial crime landscape within Russia changed since February 2022? Because we've been talking a lot about the exterior aspect, but more about the interior aspect maybe as well.
Well, since 2022, the corruption, if it's, it has gone up. We have seen an unprecedented wave of sanctions, and with that, you have a lot of business figures inside of Russia who have to offload their companies, change the papers on companies. We had an issue for a few months where Russian registries and contracts were blocked for basically everyone inside of Russia and across the globe. More so important is to plug the loopholes, because as inside of Russia, they are scrambling to change ownership of companies and, and to offload it into people who are not sanctioned. We are also seeing a lot of front companies pop up. And like Valeriya just mentioned, do business with America or a European company as the originator. And then we see this route that these dual-use products or military parts are going through several companies across Europe. I mean, there are right now several chains of this. It's through Europe, through China, and you see it moving around, ultimately going back into Russia, into the new front companies that have been formed in order to then, contribute to Russia's defense ministry. So I think we have to be extremely vigilant. We have to be careful as far as monitoring. I've been looking into a lot of US companies that have been set up in, over the past year, where you see that the purpose of the setup is ultimately to allow Russia to bypass, evade sanctions and to continue sending supplies to Russia's defense ministry. So this is definitely something we need to monitor and do a better job of plugging these loopholes. And it's just happening at such an overwhelming rate over the past year that it's hard to catch. And, unless you sit down and focus and take a minute to look into this.
Thanks, Olga. I think that's really useful insight there. And then I think I'd like to just take this on with you, Mate. I mean, so when we think back to February 2022, a lot of sanctions were placed on oligarchs and people perceived as being close to Putin, as a method of sort of attacking the sort of Russian leadership. Given the use of intermediaries by Russian oligarchs and others who access Western markets, how effective do you think these sanctions have been?
Well, thanks for the question. I think they could have been a lot more effective. The sanctions have slowed down Russia. They certainly sold a lot of newspapers in terms of yachts and helicopters and jewelry and what have you. And a lot of the more famous oligarchs are now tied up in sanctions-related litigation in London, which is also proof that Londongrad is probably becoming a trope rather than reality. London is more part of the solution rather than the problem at the moment, I would argue, compared to other jurisdictions in any case, which is where this question about intermediaries comes in. A place like Dubai or Armenia or Turkey would not see the world in the same way as we do, in the same sort of with the same sort of moral clarity. I speak to people in these jurisdictions, and what they say is, look, when Saudi Arabia destroyed Yemen, you didn't jump up and sanction Saudi Arabia. And I'm not trying to compare, right? I don't even know the details of the Yemen war, but it was a war by a bigger neighbor on a smaller neighbor, and it ended up really, and I think it continues today in a really bad way for the Yemen, for the Yemenis. And what people in Dubai are taking away from this is that we're a bunch of hypocrites, and they're going to do as much business as they want with Russia because the Russians are just as bad as us in their eyes. And so we need a system to counteract that. So I think, and this is where I'm getting political rather than talking about finance, but I think there needs to be some sort of incentive for these intermediaries to do what we would like them to do, which is to apply the sanctions. At the moment, there isn't much. There is a sort of embryonic campaign to bring India over to the West in terms of its friendship with Russia. We're trying to give India some incentives. We're trying to give them better trade terms, better sort of political exposure. And that's not easy. But unless we do something like that for the Emirates or, Central Asia or Turkey, we're going to see them acting increasingly as Russia's intermediaries, and of course that brings its own set of moral questions, because these countries are not exactly freedom-loving, utopias. They're not really Denmark or Sweden or whatever. So the world as it is today is extremely difficult, and it's not really straightforward how you make the right decision. But if our objective is to stop Russia from destroying Ukraine and potentially, as Valeriya has said, destroying a lot of other countries besides, then we need to make allies and give them something to hang on to. That's my opinion anyway.
Thanks, Mate. I think that's really interesting. That's really interesting insight from that global perspective. Bringing you in, Stephen, I guess, from the EU aspect, you've been tracking the EU response to the invasion closely over the past year. Do you think it's been strong enough against Russia? And if not, what more do you think needs to be done?
Well, I described the European Union's response as patchy. It's been good in parts and bad in parts and grey in a lot of areas. So I think one of the things Europe has to do, the European Commission is almost as powerful as the United States on FATF. So European Commission is going to have to insist on a less technical approach to FATF evaluations. So as your report has identified, Rosfin monitoring the Russians' FIU, if you will, it's excellent on paper. It ticks all the right boxes, does the right reports. So you would give it an excellent report. But we all know they're turning a blind eye to the fact that they are the FIU for a mafia state. So, so that kind of technical approach has to stop, and FATF has to become more political with a small p, insofar as, it has to take into account, the fact that Russia is a mafia state, and it has to put it on its blacklist because it's funding, as previous speakers have said, terror wars, cyber wars, and of course, the completely indefensible aggression in Ukraine. Secondly, I would say, I think as Matty said, that Austria is very duplicitous in all this, and that's clear. Too, like Raiffeisen Bank is still trading in Russia. It's dragging its heels about pulling out of Russia. So where's the European Union on pushing Vienna on getting that bank out of Russia? I think most certainly Europe needs to set up an OFAC-style agency, something like the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the United States, which is a super powerful agency that enforces sanctions worldwide. So companies and countries are afraid of OFAC sanctions, really terrified of them. And I'm sure it's one of the reasons a lot of corporates pulled out of Russia and a lot of countries abide by sanctions because of they're afraid of OFAC sanctions. So clearly, Europe needs an OFAC-style agency. Now, I heard it mooted that the new European AML authority should be the sanctions enforcer, but that's never going to happen. First of all, it's going to be a new agency and it's doomed to failure if it gets too many tasks. But certainly we need an OFAC-style agency. The European Public Prosecutor's Office has put its hands up to enforce sanctions. Give them the role immediately and see how they get on. But certainly, dragging our feet in Europe about enforcing sanctions is no longer tenable. Europe is about to criminalize sanctions and evasion. So EPPO is perfectly placed, get in there fast to enforce sanctions. I think secondly is, Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission really need to get off the fence on seizing and confiscating Russian assets. The longer the assets are in dry dock, the less valuable they are. So all those super yachts that lie in ports, Europe has to pay for their upkeep, their value is diminishing all the time. So those assets should be sold immediately. All those assets in the banks, the Russian central bank assets, they should be seized and confiscated immediately and used for the rebuilding of Ukraine and other purposes. Now, if Russia afterwards comes and says, we're taking legal action, sure, let the legal action go ahead. And if they win, they win. But right now, all those assets are diminishing in value and they will be useless in 10 years' time. So we should be selling them immediately. And then, the corporates like IKEA, I see IKEA stopped supplying and selling Cadbury's products because Cadbury's is still trading in Russia. That's a really good move. I think Valeriya spoke about Diageo. Again, Diageo needs to do more on this side. Second, other things like media, like Russia today is still available to consume in Europe. Why? It's crazy. Before the German elections, the last German elections, Russia Today's Facebook page was one of the most consumed social media sites in Russia, influencing Germany's election. Again, absolute madness. And I think, Matty referenced London is doing a lot better. It's absolutely doing a lot better. I spoke to Mark Bishop, who heads up the combating kleptocracy cell in the National Crime Agency, who's doing phenomenal work in clearing out the oligarchs in Russia or in London and going after their assets and the auction houses and the banks that facilitated them. So London's doing a whole lot better. Germany must do more. I was on a panel recently with Jörg Schmidt, who's the investigations editor with Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is the newspaper that exposed Panama, Pandora, Paradise Papers, Credit Suisse secrets, so on and so forth. He says Germany is the money laundering capital of Europe. Now, do you hear that very often? And that from Germany's biggest newspaper. And then, you know, Cyprus and Malta also have a lot of questions to answer in this space. And then I think, you know, our own law enforcement agencies need to have a more common sense approach. You can see 166 of the world's financial intelligence units are meeting today in Abu Dhabi. Now, why are they in Abu Dhabi? It's a grey listed country, United Arab Emirates, but here are our law enforcement chiefs who are in charge of going after financial crime and economic crime and sanctions evasion, and they're meeting in grey listed United Arab Emirates. Question mark, I would say, and maybe not the wisest decision in the history of the Egmont group of FIUs. Those are the things I would say. And to Olga's point about the media, again, back to media, I'm wearing my old editor's cap. Sometimes the media doesn't have to be balanced. It doesn't have to be balanced in climate change. Some would argue it doesn't have to be balanced in terms of Trump, and certainly it doesn't have to be balanced in terms of Putin. And, you know, Olga referenced, you know, the media giving both sides of the story involving the dam bombing that, you know, was an eco-crime and caused tens of thousands of refugees in Ukraine. It's clear that it was Russia that bombed the dam. But, you know, so the media doesn't necessarily always have to be balanced, albeit it should be balanced in most cases. But when it comes to the Kremlin and Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, it doesn't necessarily have to be balanced.
Thank you,
If I
Stephen.
may just jump on that point.
Yeah, jump.
You don't, so it can still be balanced, but giving some context by saying Ukraine defense minister said this, Russian defense minister said this, and by the way, he's never told the truth yet in 20 years, and especially in the past 2 years of the war. So that kind of gives you enough context to make your own conclusions.
And can I just make one small point? We are facing one of the biggest threats. Well, Europe is with Russia potentially, you know, blowing up the nuclear plant. And already the headlines have started that Ukraine and Russia trade accusations. I mean, even Russian investigative outlets reported last year that Russia was mining the plant. And now you see, you know, Ukrainian's president has made, you know, sounded the alarm over the past few days. And already with something this dangerous, you see media outlets, all the main media outlets, Russia and Ukraine trade accusations.
Well, thank you across the panel. I know we've got 6 minutes left, and actually, Olga, I wanted to bring you in on one of the questions because it's certainly something I've been fascinated by over the last couple of weeks, and I'm sure a lot of our audience have, which is the status of Wagner at the moment. So I think we've seen today that Belarus has reported Prigozhin's back in Russia, and it's unclear what's actually the status of Wagner in terms of its fighters, in terms of Prigozhin's situation in Russia. And given your experience in this field, it'd be fascinating just to understand a bit more about where you think the situation lies at the moment.
So it is very interesting because the local St. Petersburg press over the past week have been reporting that Prigozhin has been there and that he left, you know, to go to Moscow for a meeting. He came back over the past few days. He came in to receive everything that was confiscated from him. The money and the weapons and, you know, everything that they took, that is being returned back to him. So it is interesting. And at the same time, you see FSB, which is Russia's security services, leaking information of his house and the money that they seized and, you know, a shelf of wigs and various things. So there is obviously continues to be tension between two sides, and it's showing that there is internal conflict and turmoil between different agencies, between Ministry of Defense and also the security agencies and the Kremlin. Well, that said, Prigozhin is the front face for Wagner. Wagner was initially set up by GRU Colonel Dmitry Utkin. He had come back from Syria after fighting for a mercenary group. He came back, and Wagner was set up and actually named after his call sign. And it was done so in order for that to prepare for the little green men who eventually made their way into Crimea, illegally annexed Crimea, and illegally occupied Donbass. So the structure exists. And Wagner, what a lot of people, that I don't see being mentioned, that Wagner, the training base is on one of the GRU special unit headquarters. So you can't even get into this base without going through GRU checkpoints, and on one side you have Wagner, the other side GRU. So the structure as far as globally, I don't believe it's going to change. I think it will stay the same. Maybe they will change the name, but it will still be the same operatives. Maybe the more high profile ones might be shifted around. But at the end of the day, I don't see anything changing in Africa, in Latin America, in Syria, across Europe. Right now, they're extremely active in the Balkans, and trying to basically set a war off there. And that's it. So I foresee it staying the same.
Thank you, Olga, and that's really great to have your expert understanding there. I realize we've only got a few minutes left. I want to give the panelists any chance just to get across the last couple of things. Mate, you spoke a bit earlier about the UAE, and we have had a few questions about this. And I think from that global perspective, it's very clear that a lot of Russian businesses are moving towards that region. And what do you think businesses need to be doing here to sort of manage that financial crime risk? And where do you see that future lying?
Well, it's tough because as the other panelists noted, and I think this is in your report as well, there are technical ways of fulfilling your enhanced due diligence, both on Russia and on the UAE very well, and legally carry out trading and transacting with Russian companies. Even if they're under sanctions in certain jurisdictions, you can still find a way to legally trade with them whilst they're under sanctions. So if you want a technical means of carrying on business as usual through the UAE, ending up in Russia, that is very possible. And you don't have to attend this webinar to learn how, because there's loads of lawyers who are more than willing to help you. But I think down the line, it's becoming increasingly untenable. Russia is unstable internally at the moment. The Wagner group is now commingled entirely with the Kremlin. And eventually all of this stuff is going to come back. So we will see a day when all these genocidaires, as they're called in French, all of these people will have to answer for themselves. And then the second layer of people who abetted them will have to answer as well. And think of Hugo Boss, and think of the media that Hugo Boss is getting even today, and it's coming up to 100 years since all of that. So
okay, we're getting to that sort of today program moment where it's about to be closure. I just have one last question, which I think is really interesting. What could FATF do to blacklist Russia, given its existing structures? Valeriya, Stephen, either of you've got a very quick thought on that.
Sure. Well, I think the next president of FATF needs to be a European, and probably somebody from Britain. And I think that would make a huge difference.
It's about political will, about changing the procedures, or finding the procedures to respond to unprecedented actions with unprecedented response, because otherwise FATF just can't save its face, can't really claim it's a powerful organization, can't claim it's a watchdog, really.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I think on that note, we are going to have to end this now because we've hit the hour. I would encourage all attendees, if you haven't had a chance yet, to have a look at the Russia risk report, which we've launched today at this webinar. It covers a lot of the details which our panel have really been able to elaborate on. And also in terms of financial crime risks, a lot of people working in terms of practical solutions. Again, this is something that, certainly at Themis we look to support, and I'm sure a lot of our panelists can do as well. So thanks very much everyone for attending, and thank you very much to our panel, Valeriya Melnichuk, Matej Roska, Stephen Ray and Olga Lautman. It's been really fascinating hearing your insight, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you, Henry, for great moderation.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.